Hey guys, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Before we settle in for tonight's story, if you enjoy relaxing history that helps you unwind after a long day, I'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow and allows me to keep creating these long, peaceful history journeys for you. And before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy reading your comments and seeing listeners joining from all around the world. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine you've just arrived at a magnificent medieval castle. High stone walls stretch toward the sky. Colorful banners flutter in the breeze. The great hall is already coming to life. The smell of fresh bread drifts through the air. Knights polish their armor. Horses stomp impatiently in the courtyard. Nobles prepare for another comfortable day. But none of that is your world. You are not the lord. You are not the lady. You are not a knight. You are a servant. Long before the castle wakes, you are already working. While everyone else is still asleep, you're carrying heavy buckets of water, sweeping cold stone floors, lighting fireplaces, preparing breakfast. And unlike the wealthy people you serve, there is almost nowhere in the castle where you can truly be alone. You sleep beside other servants, you eat beside other servants, you work beside other servants. Even your smallest mistake is likely to be noticed by someone. Privacy, the simple idea of having a quiet place to yourself, was something most medieval servants could hardly imagine. Tonight, we're going to step quietly into their world. We'll discover where they slept, what they ate, how they spent every hour of their day, what rules they lived under, and why the ordinary men and women who kept medieval castles running rarely experienced a single moment that truly belonged to them. So settle in, relax, take a slow, deep breath, and let's travel back hundreds of years to discover why medieval servants never had privacy. The enormous wooden gate groans open with a sound that echoes across the valley. Beyond it lies a world that appears majestic from a distance, yet feels very different once you step inside. Visitors often remember the towers first. The battlements. The colorful shields hanging proudly above the entrance. They picture feasts beneath glittering chandeliers and armored knights returning from glorious adventures. But if you listen carefully, those grand stories are only the surface. Beneath every polished table, behind every warm fireplace, inside every freshly prepared chamber, someone has already been working for hours. As your feet cross the worn stone threshold, the air changes. It carries the scent of damp limestone, burning oak, fresh straw, beeswax candles, and yesterday's smoke lingering in narrow passageways. The castle is less like a palace and more like a small village folded inside thick walls, where hundreds of lives overlap from dawn until long after sunset. Almost every sound belongs to someone else's duty: the steady scrape of a broom across stone, the clatter of wooden buckets, the distant ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the soft hiss of bread rising inside great ovens, the quiet footsteps of servants already moving through corridors before daylight has fully reached the windows. Few people notice them. That is the strange comfort and quiet sadness of service. A noble may remember the beauty of the banquet. Rarely does anyone remember the young woman who spent hours polishing every silver cup. A visiting knight admires crisp linen upon his bed. He seldom wonders who washed it in icy water or carried it up endless staircases. The castle seems to run by itself. Of course, it never does. Every door opened for a guest, every blazing fire, every clean floor, every fresh loaf of bread depended upon hands that history rarely bothered to name. Most servants lived not in spacious chambers overlooking the countryside, but deep inside the hidden spaces of the castle. Narrow corridors twisted behind walls. Tiny staircases connected kitchens to halls above. Low-ceilinged workrooms buzzed with quiet activity while the Lord entertained visitors only a few steps away. There were places designed to be seen, and places designed to disappear. The servants belonged mostly to the second kind. Even as you learn your way through these winding passages, you begin noticing something unusual. There is almost always another person nearby, a cook rushing toward the pantry, a stable boy carrying oats, an older maid balancing folded linen, a messenger hurrying with sealed instructions. A child apprentice struggling beneath a basket twice his size. The castle never truly sleeps, neither do the eyes within it. Some watch to teach, some watch to supervise, some simply share the same crowded spaces because there is nowhere else to go, little by little. You realize that silence does not mean solitude. You may stand alone in a dim corridor for only a heartbeat before someone turns the corner. You may pause beside an arrow slit to admire the morning mist before another task calls you away. Even your thoughts begin keeping pace with the rhythm of the household. There is comfort in belonging to something larger than yourself, yet there is also a quiet longing for a single peaceful corner where no one is waiting, watching, or calling your name. That longing will follow you through every hallway, every staircase, every season, because before you can understand why medieval servants had so little privacy, you must first understand how someone became one in the very first place. Tomorrow's work begins long before tomorrow arrives, and so does your story. Morning arrives gently over the castle, though you hardly notice the sunrise itself. By the time pale light begins slipping through the narrow windows, the household is already moving with quiet purpose. Fires have been lit. Water has been drawn. Bread is baking somewhere below your feet. The rhythm of the castle never truly begins at dawn, because for its servants, it never really stops. Yesterday, you stepped through the gates and discovered a place where nearly every corner belonged to someone else. Today, another question quietly waits to be answered. How did you end up here? The answer rarely begins with the castle. It begins in a village many miles away, where the roads become little more than muddy tracks after rain, and where most families know one another by name. Small cottages, their walls woven from timber and daub, huddle together against cold winds. Smoke rises from simple chimneys, carrying the familiar scent of burning peat and damp wood. This is where countless medieval servants first opened their eyes. Most were not born dreaming of castle life. In truth, few people in the Middle Ages expected to choose their future at all. A person's path was often shaped long before they could walk, determined by the family into which they were born, the land surrounding their home, and the fortunes, or misfortunes, that visited them. If your parents were poor farmers, your childhood likely revolved around work almost as soon as you were strong enough to help. You gathered firewood, chased wandering geese, carried water from nearby streams, and learned to recognize the changing moods of the seasons. Every harvest mattered. A summer of heavy rain or an early frost could mean empty storage bins before winter had even reached its coldest days. There was little room for comfort, yet there was often warmth. Families lived closely together, sharing stories beside modest hearths as darkness settled outside. Children slept near parents and siblings, wrapped beneath coarse wool blankets. Privacy was already uncommon, though it carried a different feeling than it would inside the castle. Home, however crowded, was still home, but life could change with surprising speed. A poor harvest, the sickness that swept through the village, the death of a parent, a debt that could not be repaid. Any one of these could quietly reshape an entire family's future. For some children, entering service became less a choice than a necessity. A castle offered something many villages could not always promise: Regular meals, a roof that did not leak, clothing, however simple, the possibility of learning useful skills. To modern ears, becoming a servant may sound like surrendering freedom. Yet for many medieval families, it could also represent hope. Sending a son or daughter into noble service meant one less mouth to feed during difficult winters. Sometimes it also meant opportunities that life in a tiny farming village could never provide. The journey itself often felt enormous. Imagine leaving everything familiar behind, the narrow path leading past your family's cottage, the stream where you collected water, the old oak tree where children gathered during warm afternoons, even the church bell that marked every passing week. With only a small bundle of belongings, perhaps containing an extra tunic, a wooden spoon, and a treasured keepsake from home, you would follow an older servant, a traveling merchant, or perhaps even your own parents toward the distant silhouette of the castle. As its towers slowly appeared above the hills, excitement and uncertainty walked side by side. The walls looked impossibly high, the gates impossibly heavy. Inside lived people whose lives seemed almost unimaginable: lords, ladies, knights, scribes, cooks, falconers, stable masters, nurses, bakers, laundresses, musicians, and dozens of servants whose names you had never heard before. It was like entering a world within a world. Your first days would not be spent mastering great responsibilities. Instead, you watched, you listened, you learned where not to stand, which staircases belonged to the Lord's family, which doors remained closed and less invited, how deeply to bow, how quietly to move, how quickly to answer when your name was called. Older servants became your first teachers. Some were patient, remembering their own uncertain beginnings. Others expected you to learn simply by observing, believing mistakes were lessons that needed no explanation. Gradually, the unfamiliar rhythms became ordinary. The great hall no longer felt impossibly vast. The kitchens became easier to navigate. Faces that once seemed like strangers slowly became companions in shared labor. Still, one lesson revealed itself almost immediately: nothing inside the castle belonged entirely to you. Not your time, not your space, and often, not even your future, yet among these crowded halls. Friendships, skills, and quiet moments of pride could still grow in unexpected places. Tomorrow, however, those moments must wait, because long before the Lord opens his eyes, your working day is already about to begin. Night has not completely released its hold on the castle. Outside, the sky is still wrapped in deep shades of blue, and the stars linger above the silent countryside. The Lord sleeps beneath thick woolen blankets. The lady dreams behind heavy curtains embroidered with silk. Even the guards upon the walls move slowly, their footsteps softened by the cool air before dawn. But for you, the day has already begun. There are no clocks to wake you, no gentle alarm, no comforting voice calling your name. Instead, it is habit that opens your eyes. Perhaps it is the quiet shuffling of another servant rising from a nearby pallet. Perhaps it is the faint crackle of embers dying in the hearth. Or perhaps your body has simply learned that if you sleep even a few moments too long, someone else will notice before you do. You sit up carefully, trying not to disturb those still gathering the last fragments of sleep. The room is dim, only a single rushlight burns weakly in one corner, its tiny flame barely pushing back the darkness. Around you, familiar figures slowly emerge from the shadows. Someone quietly pulls on worn leather shoes. Another ties a faded woolen belt around a plain tunic. A young kitchen maid yawns behind her hand before reaching for an empty bucket waiting beside the doorway. No one speaks very much. Words can wait. Work cannot. The stone floor feels cold beneath your feet. even through your shoes. During winter, the chill seems to rise directly from the earth itself, creeping through the castle long before the first fire has been lit. You pull your cloak tighter, knowing it will not stay on for long. Outside the servant quarters, the corridors are strangely peaceful. This may be the quietest moment the castle will know all day. The banners hanging from the walls remain perfectly still. The great hall stands empty, its long tables waiting patiently for breakfast that has not yet been prepared. Moonlight slips through narrow windows, painting pale silver shapes across worn stone floors polished smooth by generations of footsteps. For a few precious minutes, the castle almost belongs to the servants alone, yet those minutes disappear quickly. The first task is often fire. Yesterday's ashes must be cleared before fresh logs can be placed inside the great hearths. Without warm fires, the noble family would awaken to cold chambers, chill dining rooms, and kitchens unable to prepare the morning meal. You kneel before the fireplace, brushing away fine grey ash that clings to your sleeves. Carefully arranged kindling catches the smallest spark, and before long, soft orange flames begin climbing through the stacked wood. The warmth spreads slowly, not quickly enough to reach your hands before the next duty calls. Elsewhere, other servants are already moving through the castle like quiet streams flowing in different directions. The kitchen boys carry water from the well before sunrise crowds the courtyard. The dairymaid checks crocks of milk and fresh butter stored in cool stone cellars. The baker has been awake even longer, kneading dough while most of the kingdom still sleeps. In the stables, sleepy horses lift their heads as familiar footsteps approach with buckets of oats and fresh hay. Each person follows an invisible routine learned through repetition rather than written instruction. No one needs to ask where to go. The castle itself seems to guide them. As dawn begins to brighten the eastern sky, sounds gradually replace silence. Wood crackles inside newly lit fireplaces, iron pots settle onto warming hearths. Doors creak open, water splashes into wooden basins. Somewhere above, a sleepy noble shifts beneath warm blankets, completely unaware that dozens of people have already spent hours preparing for that single moment of waking. Breakfast does not simply appear. Warm rooms do not create themselves. Fresh water does not fill polished pitchers by magic. Everything begins with unseen hands, your hands. Even after several mornings, there is little time to admire the growing sunrise. The castle awakens in careful layers, first the servants, then the craftsmen, then the guards changing watch. Finally, much later, the noble household. Their morning feels peaceful because yours began in darkness, as the corridors slowly fill with voices, footsteps, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting upward from the kitchens. Another realization quietly settles into your thoughts. This routine will repeat tomorrow, and the day after, until rising before the sun no longer feels unusual at all. Soon, however, your morning will grow even busier, because once the household is awake, the real work has only just begun. By the time darkness settles over the castle once again, your body has grown pleasantly heavy with exhaustion. The fires have burned low, the last wooden platters have been scrubbed clean. The great hall, so lively only hours before, has fallen almost silent. A few candles still flicker near the high table, casting long shadows across the stone floor where nobles linger over quiet conversation. Somewhere beyond the walls, an owl calls into the night, while a cool breeze slips through the narrow arrow slits that overlook the sleeping countryside. For the lord and his family, bedtime is often a peaceful retreat. A servant draws the curtains around their bed, another places fresh rushes upon the floor. A final candle is extinguished, the chamber door closes, the room belongs to them alone, but that is not the way your day ends. Instead of climbing a winding staircase toward a private chamber, you follow a familiar passage that twists downward into the quieter corners of the castle. These corridors receive little attention from visiting guests. They are practical rather than beautiful, built to move workers unseen between kitchens, storerooms, and sleeping quarters. The air grows cooler with every step. Soon you reach the room that dozens of servants simply call home. It is larger than a village cottage, yet somehow feels smaller because so many people share it. Straw-filled pallets lie close together across the floor. Some rest against stone walls. Others are tucked beneath narrow windows or squeezed into corners where there is just enough space to stretch out after another demanding day. There are no carved bedposts, no embroidered blankets, no feather mattresses waiting to soften tired bones. Most bedding is simple: a rough sack stuffed with straw, a wool blanket that has seen many winters, perhaps a folded cloak to serve as an extra pillow. You choose your usual place, though your is not quite the right word. Nothing here truly belongs to one person forever. If new servants arrive or older ones leave, sleeping places quietly shift. Sometimes two friends lie beside one another for months. Other times, strangers become neighbors overnight, simply because the household has grown busier. As more servants return from their final duties, the room slowly fills with familiar sounds. Leather shoes are slipped off with tired sighs, belts loosen, wooden buckets are set quietly against the wall. Someone whispers a brief prayer before lying down, another rubs sore shoulders earned from carrying water throughout the day. The room is never completely silent. Even after the candles are extinguished, life continues. Someone coughs softly, a stable boy snores almost immediately, another servant turns over, causing dry straw to rustle beneath the blanket. Rain begins tapping gently against the castle roof. While wind hums through unseen cracks in ancient stone, sleep arrives not because the room is peaceful, but because everyone is simply too tired to remain awake. For many young servants, this crowded room becomes an unexpected family, the older maid who reminds everyone to dry wet shoes before morning. The cheerful baker's apprentice who somehow keeps smiling despite rising long before everyone else. The elderly porter whose stories of distant castles drift softly through the darkness before sleep claims him. These small conversations matter. They ease homesickness, they soften difficult days, they remind you that nearly everyone here once stood exactly where you stand now. Still, there are moments when you long for something impossible. Perhaps only a few quiet minutes with your own thoughts. A place where no one hears you sigh after a difficult day, a window where you might simply watch moonlight cross the fields beyond the walls without another voice interrupting the silence. Privacy, in the modern sense, feels almost unimaginable. Changing clothes happens discreetly, but never truly alone. Sleeping means sharing every sound the night has to offer. Dreams are interrupted by neighbors rising early for different duties. Even illness rarely grants solitude. If someone develops a fever, others remain nearby to offer water, adjust blankets, or quietly continue sleeping only a few feet away. The castle leaves very little empty space, not because people wish to invade one another's lives, but because space itself was precious. Stone walls were expensive to build, every room served a purpose. Comfort often yielded to practicality, yet something remarkable grows within these crowded quarters. People begin recognizing one another's habits without speaking. You know who wakes first, who mutters softly while dreaming, who hums forgotten village songs before falling asleep, who quietly cries during the first weeks away from home, believing no one notices. Of course, someone always notices, not out of judgment, but because no life inside the servants' quarters remains hidden for very long. as you pull your blanket close and listen to the steady breathing filling the room. Your eyelids slowly grow heavy. Tomorrow will arrive sooner than you would like, and when it does, you will discover that sharing a room is only the beginning, because even the clothes upon your back are rarely yours alone. Morning has come and gone once again. The castle hums with its familiar rhythm, as dependable as the changing seasons. Smoke curls lazily from the kitchen chimneys. The scent of fresh bread drifts through the passageways before disappearing into the great hall above. Somewhere in the courtyard, a blacksmith's hammer strikes iron with patient precision, while horses shuffle quietly in their stalls, waiting for the day's work to begin. You have now spent enough time within these walls to understand something the castle never says aloud. Very little here truly belongs to you, not the room where you sleep, not the corridors where you walk, not even the hours of your day. Yet there is another lesson. Quieter still, one that reveals itself not through grand events, but through the ordinary objects that pass from hand to hand every single day. In the modern world, we become attached to possessions. A favorite coat, a comfortable chair, a treasured book resting on a familiar shelf. For a medieval servant, life was rarely built around ownership, it was built around usefulness. Take your clothing, for example. The tunic you wear is plain, woven from coarse wool that feels slightly rough against your skin. Its color is difficult to name, somewhere between faded brown and weathered gray. Years of washing have softened the fabric, though patches stitched carefully across the elbows and sleeves reveal that it has already lived several lives before reaching your shoulders. You are almost certainly not its first owner. Perhaps it once belonged to an older servant who grew too tall. Perhaps it was passed down after someone married and left the household. Perhaps it simply outlasted the person who wore it before. Nothing is wasted, every thread has value. When a sleeve tears, it is mended. When a hem frays, it is stitched again. Only when the cloth can no longer hold another patch does it finally become something else, a cleaning rag, a wrapping cloth, or strips for repairing sacks. The same quiet economy reaches nearly every corner of castle life. Wooden bowls are shared at mealtimes, knives pass from one pair of hands to another, buckets rarely belong to any single person. A lantern carried through dark passageways tonight may guide someone else tomorrow. Even the straw inside your bedding is replaced only when absolutely necessary. Nothing disappears simply because it grows old, it changes purpose. This careful way of living is not born from miserliness. It grows from necessity. Creating even simple possessions required time, skill, and materials that were never taken for granted. A wool cloak represented months of work. Leather shoes demanded the labor of skilled craftsmen. A sturdy wooden chest could serve generations of one family. Every object carried the memory of the hands that made it. Some servants owned only a handful of truly personal belongings. A wooden comb carved by a parent, a small linen pouch holding sewing needles, a smooth pebble gathered from a childhood river, a tiny wooden cross worn beneath a tunic, perhaps a simple spoon brought from home, familiar in the hand even after many years. These were not valuable because they were expensive. They were valuable because they remembered a different life. On quiet evenings, someone might carefully remove such a keepsake from a pocket, turning it slowly between tired fingers before placing it safely out of sight once again. For just a moment, the crowded castle faded away, home returned, yet even these precious possessions had to remain small. Space was limited. Large trunks belonged to wealthier people. Servants often kept everything they owned inside a modest cloth bundle or a simple wooden box tucked beneath a pallet. There was no room for excess. Curiously, this sharing shaped relationships as much as it shaped daily life. When someone's shoe split during winter, another servant might lend an older pair until repairs could be made if a cloak became soaked during heavy rain. A companion offered dry wool without expecting payment. Needles, thread, and bits of cloth quietly traveled from one person to another as naturally as conversation. Generosity often grew from having very little. Everyone understood that someday they might need the same kindness in return. Of course, disagreements happened. A misplaced spoon, a borrowed belt returned a little later than promised, a blanket accidentally claimed by the wrong person during a sleepy winter morning. Such misunderstandings usually faded as quickly as they appeared. Life inside the castle left little room for holding grudges over ordinary things. The work ahead was simply too demanding. As weeks become months, you notice an unexpected change within yourself. You begin caring less about owning many possessions. Instead, you value dependable companions, a well-mended pair of shoes, a warm meal after a cold morning, a blanket that keeps out the winter wind. Comfort is measured differently here. Not by abundance, but by enough, and perhaps that is why privacy remains so difficult to find. When nearly everything is shared, your possessions, your room, your meals, even your daily labor, it becomes almost impossible to separate your life from the lives of those around you. Soon, however, you will discover that sharing belongings is only part of the story, because wherever you walk inside these ancient walls, someone is almost always watching. Another morning slips quietly into the castle. The first rays of sunlight have only begun to touch the highest towers, painting them with pale gold, while the lower courtyards remain wrapped in cool shadow. A faint breeze stirs the banners above the gatehouse. Somewhere in the kitchens, bread is already baking, and the comforting aroma drifts through hidden passageways that only the servants know by heart. By now, these winding halls no longer feel unfamiliar. You know which staircase leads to the pantry, which corridor reaches the stables, which heavy oak door always creaks. No matter how carefully it is opened, you move more confidently than when you first arrived, and yet there is one feeling you have never quite escaped, the feeling that someone is always nearby, and not in a frightening way, not as though danger waits around every corner, but as a quiet, constant presence that follows nearly every part of your day. A castle is never empty. Even before the noble household rises, dozens of people are already moving through its halls. The cook checks the morning fire. The laundress carries damp linen toward the drying yard. The stable master inspects the horses. Messengers hurry across the courtyard with folded letters tucked safely beneath their cloaks. Everywhere you look, someone is working, and because everyone is working, everyone notices everyone else. It begins with simple observation. An older maid sees you carrying a bucket and reminds you not to spill water on the polished floor. The baker notices you've forgotten to close the flour chest before mice discover it. The steward quietly points toward a crooked tablecloth before the lord enters the hall. These are not always scoldings. Often, they are lessons. Experience passes from one servant to another through watchful eyes more than spoken instruction. The castle itself seems to teach by constant observation. Above nearly every group of servants stands someone responsible for organizing their work. In the kitchens, the head cook directs every meal with calm authority. In the stables, the stable master knows every horse by name and temperament. The housekeeper keeps careful watch over linens, sleeping chambers, and the countless small details that guests never notice unless something has gone wrong. Each person answers to someone else. Even those with authority remain accountable to the steward, who oversees much of the household on behalf of the lord. Responsibility flows downward, just as expectations flow upward. There are few moments when your work goes completely unseen. If you sweep a hallway well, someone notices. If you leave dust beneath a bench, someone notices that too. not because servants lived beneath harsh eyes every waking moment, but because the smooth running of the castle depended upon everyone doing their part. One forgotten task could quietly become another person's burden. A fire left unattended might leave an entire chamber cold. A stable door left unlatched could allow valuable horses to wander. A kitchen delivery delayed by only a few minutes might affect dozens of people waiting for their morning meal. Small duties carried surprisingly large consequences. There was another reason people watched so carefully: trust. Many servants handled valuable objects every day: silver goblets, fine linen, wax seals, jewelry boxes, cellar keys. Not every servant had access to every room, and trust was earned gradually over years of dependable service. A newcomer rarely carried the same responsibilities as someone who had faithfully served the household for decades. Reliability mattered more than speed, quiet honesty mattered more than cleverness. As time passed, familiar faces became reassuring rather than intimidating. You began recognizing the steward's slow, measured footsteps before seeing him. You could tell which cook entered the pantry simply by the rhythm of her wooden clogs. Even the older maid's gentle cough became part of the castle's daily music. The people watching you were also people you quietly watched in return. Without realizing it, every servant learned the habits of everyone around them: who preferred to begin work in silence, who hummed softly while kneading bread, who always paused to help younger workers lift heavy baskets, who smiled with their eyes, even if they rarely smiled with their lips. The castle became a place where observation created understanding. Still, there were moments when being seen felt strangely heavy. Imagine standing beside a window for only a minute longer than necessary. Before long, someone asks whether another task needs doing. Pause too long in the courtyard, and a passing servant wonders if you've been sent on an errand. Walk through the wrong doorway, and someone gently redirects you before a mistake becomes an embarrassment. It is not cruelty, it is simply the rhythm of communal life. In a place where hundreds of people live and work together, privacy slowly dissolves into shared routine. Your actions become part of everyone else's day, and theirs become part of yours. Perhaps that is why servants grew so skilled at reading expressions: a raised eyebrow from the steward, a quiet nod from the housekeeper, a grateful smile from the baker after receiving fresh water. Entire conversations unfolded without a single spoken word. By evening, as shadows stretch once more across the courtyard, you realize something unexpected. Being watched has changed you. Your footsteps have become quieter, your movements more careful, your hands more confident. Without noticing, you have begun carrying yourself like someone who belongs within these walls. Tomorrow, however, your attention must turn toward those who matter most inside the castle, because once the Lord's family awakens, their day begins with your hands already at work. By now, the castle feels less like a distant structure and more like a living rhythm you've learned to move with. You no longer hesitate in the corridors. You no longer count the steps between one task and the next. Even the heavy doors, once intimidating, now respond to your hands with familiar resistance, as though they recognize your presence. Outside, the day is fully awake. Sunlight spills across the courtyard stones, warming the cold places that held morning shadows only hours ago. The noble household has risen. The castle, in its most structured form, begins to reveal its purpose, because now, your work turns toward them. The Lord's family does not simply live inside the castle. They define it. Every corridor, every room, every carefully placed object exists in relation to their comfort, their routine, their authority, and yet, they rarely see the effort it takes to maintain that world around them. In the early hours, before their first appearance, the great hall transforms. Long wooden tables are wiped until they reflect faint light from the windows above. Benches are aligned with precise attention. Fresh rushes are scattered across the floor, releasing a faint earthy scent as footsteps press them down. Silver goblets are polished until they catch the sun like still water. Everything is prepared not just for function, but for appearance. A sense of effortless order must be preserved at all times. When the Lord enters, it must feel as though the castle has always been ready for him. In the kitchens below, the day moves with quiet urgency. Pots are stirred, bread is sliced, meat is carved with practiced precision. The head cook coordinates every movement like a conductor guiding an unseen orchestra. Nothing is rushed in appearance, yet nothing is idle. Every dish has its place, every plate has its timing. Every servant understands that a single delay can ripple upward through the entire household. When meals are ready, they do not travel alone. They are carried carefully, almost ceremonially, from the kitchens to the great hall above. Staircases once used only by servants now feel heavier with purpose. You walk slowly, not because you are tired, but because the food you carry is part of a larger performance of order and respect. Inside the great hall, the Lord's family begins to gather. The Lord himself often arrives first. His presence quiet but unmistakable. The lady follows, attended by a maid who adjusts the folds of her gown with careful hands. Children appear shortly after, their movements lighter, less restrained, though still guided by expectation. Even their laughter, when it comes, feels controlled by the space around them. Your role, like that of many others, is not to join their world, but to support it from its edges. You serve without lingering, you speak only when necessary, you move like part of the room itself. Food is placed, water is poured, platters are exchanged with silent precision. Eyes are kept lowered, not from fear alone, but from habit formed through repetition. The noble family rarely acknowledges each individual servant. Instead, they acknowledge the service, a nod toward a filled cup, a gesture toward a cleared plate, a brief word of approval that passes quickly, like wind through an open window. And yet, even in this distance, a strange structure of dependence exists. Their comfort relies on your movement. Their meals rely on your preparation. Their quiet morning depends on your unseen hours. After breakfast, the household disperses into its many roles. The Lord may meet with advisors. The lady may oversee household matters or attend to correspondence. Children are guided by tutors into lessons that echo softly through distant rooms, and the servants shift again, adjusting to the next wave of tasks. Beds must be aired, chambers must be cleaned, water must be refreshed. Ashes must be removed from fireplaces that have already served their morning purpose. Everything flows forward, as if the castle itself refuses to remain still. Occasionally, you catch small moments that reveal the human side of those you serve. A child pauses at a window, watching birds move across the sky with quiet fascination. The lady lingers for a breath longer than necessary beside a sunlit corridor, as though remembering something distant. The Lord stands for a moment in silence. After the hall empties, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. These moments pass quickly. They are not meant to interrupt the structure of the day. By midday, the castle settles into a steadier rhythm. Work continues in layers, each servant responsible for a different piece of the household's invisible machinery. And through it all, you begin to understand something subtle but important. Serving the Lord's family is not only about obedience, it is about timing, precision, anticipating needs before they are spoken. It is about becoming part of a system so carefully balanced that even silence has its purpose. As afternoon light begins to soften against the stone walls, you realize the day has moved far more quickly than it felt, and yet, there is still no true pause. only transitions, because even when the Lord rests, the castle does not. The castle never truly becomes still, even in its quietest moments. There is always something being moved, washed, repaired, or carried from one corner to another. Time here does not feel like a straight line. It feels more like a cycle. Repeating, folding back into itself, never quite finished. By now, your hands have learned the weight of routine. Water buckets feel familiar. Stone floors no longer surprise your knees with their coldness. Even the smell of wood smoke and damp cloth has become part of the background of your days. And yet, no matter how much you do, there is always more waiting. The work inside a medieval castle does not announce itself as a single task. It arrives as hundreds of small ones. In the early hours, before the great hall is fully awake, cleaning begins again, not because it was left undone, but because it was already used. Dust settles overnight on polished surfaces, as if the air itself contributes to the work. Footsteps from the previous day leave faint traces across stone floors. Ash gathers in hearths even when no one is watching. Nothing stays clean for long, so you begin again. Water is drawn from the well, heavy and cold, rising slowly with each pull of the rope. Your arms have grown used to the rhythm, though the effort never fully disappears. Buckets are carried back through the courtyard, where other servants are already moving in different directions, each with their own invisible list of duties. In the kitchens, cooking is not a single event either. It is preparation, correction, repetition. A stew is tasted, adjusted, tasted again. Bread is baked, then replaced with fresh batches before the last one is even fully gone. Vegetables are chopped in steady, unending cycles, as though the castle consumes time as much as food. Nothing is made once. Everything is maintained. Farther down in the corridors, washing takes its own quiet form of persistence. Linen is carried in baskets, damp from use, heavy with the traces of a household that never stops living. Water grows colder with every rinse. Soap, rough and handmade, slowly wears down in your hands. Sheets that were clean only days ago return again, as if the castle refuses to allow anything to remain unchanged for too long. Carrying is another language of work entirely. You carry trays between rooms. You carry firewood through narrow hallways. You carry messages you are not meant to read. You carry silence when words are unnecessary. Sometimes it feels less like moving objects, and more like moving the castle itself. One piece at a time. There is rarely a moment when all tasks are complete at once. Instead, one finishes just in time for another to begin. A cleaned room is immediately used again. A washed garment is worn again. A cleared table is soon filled again. At first, this endlessness feels overwhelming, but slowly, something changes. Your hands begin to remember before your mind does. Your body moves toward tasks without waiting for instruction. You start to recognize the invisible order. Beneath the chaos, not everything is random, not everything is urgent. The castle has its own quiet logic, built on repetition and necessity. Even the older servants move with this understanding. They do not rush. They do not pause longer than needed. They simply continue, and somewhere within that continuation, a strange kind of peace begins to form, not the peace of silence, but the peace of knowing what comes next. Still, there are moments when exhaustion settles deeper than words can describe, when your shoulders ache in a way that feels older than your years, when even sitting still for a few breaths feels like a small luxury. In those moments, you begin to understand something unspoken about life within these walls. Rest is not the absence of work, it is simply a pause between repetitions. As evening approaches, the castle softens once again into dimmer tones. Fires are reduced to glowing embers. Water buckets are set aside, only to be refilled again tomorrow. Clean floors will not remain clean, fresh linen will not remain fresh, and yet, everything is prepared again anyway, because tomorrow is never different enough to change the pattern, and just as you think the day is finally drawing to a close, another task quietly appears at the edge of the night. By the time the castle settles into its midday rhythm, the world above you has already eaten. You can almost feel it in the air. The great hall, once filled with the sound of clinking cups and quiet conversation, now carries only the faint echo of what happened there. The long wooden tables have been wiped clean. The benches pushed back into their precise positions. Even the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread has begun to fade, replaced once again by stone, wood, and smoke. The lord has dined, the lady has eaten, the household above the stairs has already experienced their moment of warmth and fullness, and now it is your turn, but not in the way you might expect for servants. Meals are rarely centered around gathering together in comfort or ceremony. Instead, they come at the edges of the day, shaped entirely by what remains after everything important has already taken place. In the kitchens, the fire still burns, though it is calmer now. Not the urgent blaze of morning preparation, but a steady, patient glow that holds warmth rather than creates it. Large pots remain on the hearth, filled with what was set aside, leftover stew, pieces of bread that did not make it to the high table, scraps of roasted meat carefully removed from bones, vegetables that were prepared in excess, just in case the Lord's guests desired more than they consumed. Nothing is wasted. Everything is repurposed. A servant ladles food into a wooden bowl. Another breaks bread into smaller portions, stretching what remains so it can feed more people. There is no silence of ceremony here, no long speeches or structured etiquette, only quiet efficiency. You find a place to sit where there is space, often beside the same familiar faces you have come to know through shared exhaustion. The room is not empty, but it feels less crowded than the servant dormitory at night. People eat quickly, not out of lack of appreciation, but because time never truly pauses for long. The food itself is simple, hearty, warm, filling. It is not the carefully arranged meal served above in polished silver dishes, but it carries its own kind of value. It restores what the day has taken. It steadies hands that have been working since before sunrise. There are moments when you notice how different the two worlds of eating truly are. Above, meals are slow. Below, meals are practical. Above, food is presented. Below, food is received. Yet in both places, it fulfills the same quiet need to continue. Occasionally, a servant is assigned to carry portions upstairs during a meal. In those moments, you catch glimpses of the dining hall while it is still alive with noble presence. Candles burning steadily in iron holders, silver goblets reflecting warm light, laughter rising briefly before fading into conversation. It feels distant, like watching a scene through a window that does not open for you, and yet, there is no resentment in most of these moments, only distance. A recognition that each space in the castle serves its own role. Like rooms in a single body, after eating, there is little time to linger. Bowls are collected, utensils are washed, scraps are sorted for animals or composted where possible. Even the act of eating folds quickly back into labor. The castle does not allow its servants to remain idle for long. Still, there is a quiet comfort in these shared meals, not because they are luxurious, but because they are consistent. No matter how difficult the day becomes, there will be something warm waiting afterward, something to hold you steady before the next set of tasks begins. In a strange way, this rhythm becomes its own form of security: work, then food, then work again. The simplicity of it removes uncertainty, even if it removes rest as well. As you finish your meal and set aside your empty bowl, the kitchen is already shifting once more. New tasks are being prepared, firewood is being checked, water is being fetched. Plans for the evening meal are already forming, even before the current one has fully ended, and you realize, as you stand and wipe your hands clean, that nothing in the castle truly concludes, it only transforms. Even eating is just another step in the ongoing movement of the day. Evening settles slowly over the castle, the way it always does. Without ceremony, without announcement, the light outside fades first from gold to amber, then to a softer gray that wraps itself around the stone walls like a blanket. Inside, the torches are lit one by one, each flame pushing back a small circle of darkness, never enough to fully erase it. By now, you have learned the shape of this place, you know the corridors, you know the rhythms, you know the people who pass you at the same hours each day, as predictable as the bells that sometimes echo from the chapel tower, and still, there is something you cannot quite escape. You are never alone, not truly. Not in the way modern minds might understand. Solitude. Inside the castle, silence does not mean emptiness, it only means distance between footsteps. Even when you stand still in a corridor, the castle continues around you. Somewhere nearby, a servant is climbing stairs with a basket of linen. Somewhere below, water is being heated for washing. Somewhere above, a door opens softly, followed by the rustle of fabric and the quiet exchange of instructions. Life does not pause for any single person. It simply flows past them. At first, this constant presence feels overwhelming. Every movement seems to belong to someone else's awareness. Every pause feels temporary, as if it might be interrupted at any moment. Even your thoughts begin to adjust, becoming more careful, more measured, as though they too might be observed. But slowly, something changes. You begin to understand that this lack of solitude is not the same as being watched in suspicion. It is more like being woven into a larger pattern, a living structure where every thread is visible because it is connected to the others. There are no hidden corners where life does not reach. Even the quietest storage rooms are visited regularly. Even the narrowest staircases carry footsteps throughout the day. Even the darkest cellars are entered for supplies, repairs, or inspection. In a village, one might find a moment alone beneath a tree, or beside a river, or within a field that stretches far enough to swallow sound. Inside a castle, space is measured differently. Not by distance, but by use. Every room has a purpose, every corridor has traffic, every silence is temporary, and because of that, even solitude must be created in fragments. A pause while waiting for water to boil, a moment beside a window before the next task begins, a breath held between one instruction and another. These are the closest things to being alone, yet even then, you remain within reach of others. Not in a restrictive sense, but in a shared one. Someone might pass behind you without speaking, another might enter the room just as you are about to leave. A familiar face might appear at the edge of your vision, nodding briefly before continuing on their path. It is a world built on overlap, and over time, you begin to realize that this constant proximity changes how people relate to each other. Silence becomes meaningful, a nod carries more weight than words. A shared glance across a crowded corridor can say more than a full conversation in another life. Even emotions are rarely hidden for long. Fatigue is seen in slower movements, joy appears in lighter steps, worry lingers in hesitation before tasks. Nothing stays completely private because nothing stays completely separate. Still, there are moments when the lack of solitude presses more heavily than others. Late at night, when the corridors grow quieter but never empty. Early in the morning, when you wake before others and still hear movement somewhere in the distance. During long hours of repetitive work, when the same faces appear again and again, like echoes of the same day, in those moments, a strange longing sometimes appears, not for isolation exactly, but for a single space that belongs entirely to you. A space where you are not responding to anyone, not adjusting, not observing, not being observed, but the castle, by its very nature, does not allow for long stretches of separation. It is designed for connection, not solitude, for movement, not stillness, for shared effort, not individual retreat, and so life continues in its gentle, unbroken pattern. One person finishes a task, another begins it, one door closes, another opens, one voice fades, another replaces it. As you walk toward the end of your shift, the castle feels less like a place you are trapped inside, and more like a place you are constantly moving through, alongside everyone else who belongs to it. And somewhere in that realization lies something unexpected, not comfort exactly, not discomfort either, but an understanding that in this world, being alone was never really the goal, being connected was, even if you never had a moment entirely to yourself. Night has not fully left the castle yet, even though the day has already begun. In the lower corridors, torches still burn low, their flames bending slightly in the cold morning air. The stone walls hold onto the chill of the night, as if reluctant to release it. Somewhere above, the noble household stirs slowly, but below, life has already been in motion for hours, and before any serious work begins today, there is something else that must be faced. The body. In a modern world, washing is often private, quick, and effortless. But inside a medieval castle, cleanliness is not a simple, isolated moment. It is a shared, practical process, shaped by water, weather, and whatever time the household can afford. There are no locked doors for personal bathrooms as you might imagine today. Instead, washing happens in spaces that serve many purposes at once, near the kitchens, where warm water can be prepared, in courtyards, where sunlight helps dry wet cloth, or in small washrooms tucked into stone corners of the castle, always slightly damp, always smelling faintly of ash, soap, and heated iron. Water is never taken for granted, it must be drawn from wells, carried in buckets, heated over fire, and shared among many hands. By the time it reaches you, it has already traveled a long way. For servants, bathing is not an indulgence, it is maintenance, a way to continue working without illness, without discomfort, without slowing the household down. You carry your bucket carefully through the corridor. The water inside shifts with each step, reminding you of its weight. Steam rises gently from its surface, fogging the edges of your vision as you move toward the washing area. There are others already there, not in silence, but in routine. A maid rinsing cloth strips used for cleaning, a young servant washing soot from his hands after tending the hearths, an older worker carefully scraping dirt from worn boots that have crossed too many stone floors to count. No one lingers longer than necessary, not because of discomfort, but because there is always something else waiting. The act of washing begins with simplicity: water poured over hands, a cloth dipped and wrung out, soap, often rough, homemade, and uneven in texture, worked slowly into skin and fabric. The smell is sharp at first, earthy and strong, cutting through the lingering scent of smoke and bread and animals that clings to everyone who lives within the castle walls. Cleanliness is never perfect, but it is enough to reset the body for another day. Hair is another matter entirely. Long hair is often tied back, braided, or covered for work. Washing it requires more time, more water, and more patience than the morning schedule usually allows. So it is done less frequently, often in shared spaces where warm water can be reused carefully. Lice and discomfort are part of the reality many accept quietly. Still, care is taken where it can be given. Cloth is rinsed, skin is scrubbed, hands are checked for cuts or cracks from cold water and rough labor. These small acts of attention matter more than they first appear, because inside a castle, illness spreads quickly. A single untreated infection can slow a worker. A slowed worker affects a task, a delayed task affects many others. So cleanliness becomes not just personal, but communal responsibility. As you finish washing, the cold air touches your damp skin sharply, reminding you that warmth inside the castle is never constant. You dry your hands on a worn cloth, you tighten your clothing again, and you feel, briefly, like a new version of yourself has stepped forward, not changed in identity, but reset in readiness. Nearby, conversation remains soft and practical. Someone mentions a missing bucket, another reminds a companion to clean behind the pantry shelves, a third jokes quietly about the cold water, earning a tired smile rather than laughter. Even in these moments, privacy does not exist in the modern sense, but there is comfort in shared routine. Everyone here understands the same discomforts, the same cold mornings, the same rough soap, the same rush to prepare the body for a day that does not wait for anyone. As you leave the washing area, the castle feels slightly different, not cleaner exactly, but sharper or awakened, and you realize something subtle. Even something as personal as washing your own body is not entirely your own time. It is part of the rhythm, part of the system, part of the life that moves through these stone walls without pause. And as you step back into the corridor, still damp at the edges of your sleeves, the next task is already waiting just beyond the light. The castle does not offer silence in the way an empty place might. It offers something else instead, a constant presence of people. Moving, working, passing through the same corridors day after day, until unfamiliar faces slowly become familiar, and familiar faces begin to feel like part of the environment itself. By now, you recognize the rhythm of those around you, not just their tasks, but their habits, the way someone ties their apron before entering the kitchen, the way another pauses briefly before opening a heavy door, as if preparing for its weight, the way footsteps echo differently depending on who is carrying them. Inside this crowded world, something unexpected begins to form. Not planned, not instructed, but quietly inevitable. Friendship. It does not arrive in grand moments, it grows slowly, through shared repetition, a glance exchanged during early morning work, a small nod after a difficult task is finally completed, a quiet laugh that escapes when no supervisor is nearby. These are the small threads that begin to connect people. Servants do not often have long conversations during work. There is always something to carry, something to clean, something to prepare. But in the spaces between those tasks, connection appears, in the kitchen while waiting for bread to rise, in the courtyard while water buckets are refilled, on staircases where two people pass each other too often to remain strangers. At first, these interactions are simple, practical, even silent, but over time, they begin to carry warmth. You learn who prefers quiet mornings, who speaks only when necessary, who hums softly while working without realizing it, who always seems to know when someone else is struggling. These small understandings become a kind of language. Not spoken aloud, but shared anyway. In a place where privacy does not truly exist, companionship takes its place, because when every moment is lived alongside others, emotional distance becomes difficult to maintain for long. There is one servant who always remembers where tools are left behind, saving others from unnecessary searching, another who quietly shares food when someone misses a meal due to extra work. Someone else who covers another's duties for a few minutes of rest without asking for anything. In return, these acts are not written down, they are not rewarded, they simply happen, and because they happen repeatedly, they begin to define the atmosphere of life inside the castle. Of course, not every relationship is perfect. Tiredness can shorten patience, mistakes can create frustration, confusion over tasks can lead to sharp words spoken too quickly and regretted just as fast, but even conflict rarely lasts long. There is simply too much work waiting to allow distance to grow. By the next task, cooperation is already necessary again, and so, slowly, understanding returns. One of the strongest bonds formed among servants is not based on similarity, but on shared timing. People who wake together, work together, rest together. Over time, they begin to understand each other without speaking. A gesture becomes enough, a pause becomes meaningful. Even silence between two people can feel comfortable rather than empty. In the evenings, when work finally softens and torches begin to glow against the stone walls, small groups gather in corners of the servant quarters or kitchen spaces. Not formal gatherings, just quiet presence. Someone might tell a simple story from before they arrived at the castle, another might speak of a village far away. Described in fragments of memory that grow softer with time, laughter appears, not loud or disruptive, but gentle, like a release of pressure after a long day. These moments matter more than they seem, because in a life where so much is shared, space, time, work, what remains most personal is experience, and sharing experience creates something powerful, a sense of belonging. Still, there is always an awareness beneath it all. These friendships exist inside a system that does not pause for emotion. If someone falls ill, others take on their work. If someone leaves, the rhythm continues without hesitation. The castle does not remember individuals in the way people do, but people remember each other, and that memory becomes its own quiet resistance to forgetting. As you move through another evening corridor, passing familiar faces lit by flickering torchlight, you realize something subtle. You are no longer simply working alongside strangers, you are part of a group that recognizes each other without needing to explain why, and in a place where privacy does not exist, that recognition becomes its own form of comfort, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like footsteps that match your own in the dark. By now, the castle no longer feels unfamiliar. Its sounds have become predictable, its rhythms, almost comforting in their repetition, yet beneath that familiar surface lies something that shapes every movement you make. Even when no one speaks of it directly, rules, not always written, not always spoken aloud, but always present. In a place like this, order is not maintained by constant shouting or visible punishment. Instead, it exists as an invisible structure learned slowly through observation, correction, and memory. You learn quickly that every space has its purpose, every task has its timing, every action has its expectation, and stepping outside those expectations, even slightly, is enough to draw attention. It begins with small things, where you are allowed to stand in a corridor, how close you may approach certain doors, which staircases are meant for servants, and which are reserved for the noble household. At first, it all feels confusing, like learning a language without written grammar. But over time, your body begins to understand before your thoughts do. You slow down near certain entrances. You lower your gaze in specific halls. You adjust your pace depending on who is nearby. These behaviors are not always ordered, they are absorbed. One of the most important rules inside the castle is simple in appearance, yet complex in practice. Do not interrupt the flow. Everything here moves in sequence. Food is prepared in order. rooms are cleaned in order, messages are delivered in order. When something breaks that sequence, even briefly, it affects others who are already waiting for their turn in the chain. So servants learn to think ahead, to anticipate what comes next, to avoid becoming a delay in someone else's work. Another rule is silence, though not in the strict sense of never speaking. It is more about timing, knowing when speech is necessary, and when it would only interrupt. In the presence of the lord or lady, words are chosen carefully. In the kitchens, conversation is practical. In corridors, silence often speaks louder than anything else. Over time, you begin to understand that silence itself is a form of respect, but there are consequences for breaking these quiet expectations, not always severe, but always memorable. A misplaced item might lead to extra work for the entire group. Arriving late to a task might shift responsibility onto someone already exhausted. Entering the wrong space at the wrong time can disrupt carefully planned routines, and so correction becomes part of daily life. Sometimes it comes as a reminder, a glance, a word spoken in passing, a gentle instruction to try again. Other times, it is more formal, additional labor assigned to reinforce attention, a moment of embarrassment that stays in memory longer than the task itself. But punishment, in most cases, is not about fear, it is about maintenance, keeping the structure of the castle functioning without interruption. There is also the rule of awareness. You are expected to notice what others might need before they ask. A fire growing low, a table becoming crowded, a bucket left empty, a corridor needing sweeping even if no one has yet pointed it out. This constant awareness becomes second nature. You begin to see the castle differently, not as a single place, but as many overlapping needs happening at once. Some servants become especially skilled at this. They seem to move slightly ahead of everyone else, arriving just before a task becomes urgent. Others learn through repetition, slowly refining their attention over weeks and months. Mistakes are not unusual, especially for those new to service, but repetition teaches quickly, not through words alone, but through experience. Perhaps the most important unspoken rule is this: do not let your absence be noticed. In a place where everything depends on movement, being missing creates disruption. If one person is not present, someone else must fill the gap, and so reliability becomes one of the most valued traits inside the castle. Not perfection, not speed, but presence, consistent, predictable presence. As the days pass, you begin to internalize these rules without thinking about them. You find yourself adjusting before anyone reminds you. You notice details before they become problems. You step aside instinctively when someone of higher rank approaches, and in doing so, you become part of the system in a deeper way, not just as a worker, but as a participant in its rhythm. Yet even within this structure, life is not rigid in every moment. There are pauses, small breaths between tasks, quiet exchanges that soften the edges of discipline, a shared look that says, "I understand," a small nod that acknowledges effort, a brief moment of relief when a task is completed without correction. These moments remind you that rules are not only restrictions, they are also what allow the castle to function at all. Without them, everything would collapse into confusion. With them, everything moves, even if it never truly stops. As evening begins to settle once again over the stone walls, you realize something quietly: the rules have not disappeared, they have simply become part of you, and tomorrow, without needing to think about it, you will follow them again. Mistakes inside the castle rarely announce themselves with noise. They begin quietly: a forgotten object, a delayed task, a door left slightly ajar when it should have been closed. And yet, even the smallest slip can ripple outward in ways that are felt far beyond the moment it happens. By now, you understand the rhythm of the household well enough to know that nothing exists in isolation, every action connects to another. Every delay becomes someone else's extra effort, every overlooked detail becomes a problem that must be repaired before it grows, and so, mistakes are never truly private, even when no one raises their voice, even when nothing appears dramatic, they are noticed. The first sign is usually subtle, a pause in conversation that lasts just a little too long, a glance exchanged between experienced servants, a quiet adjustment to your assigned task without explanation. It is not always immediate correction. Sometimes it is simply recognition that something did not go as intended. Inside the castle, correction is part of daily life, not something reserved for rare moments of failure. If a floor is not swept properly, it is swept again. If a fire is lit incorrectly, it is rebuilt. If a delivery is delayed, someone else takes over the remaining work so the rhythm of the household does not break. The goal is never to shame, it is to restore balance. But for the person who made the mistake, the feeling is still deeply personal, especially in the beginning. When you are new to service, every correction feels heavier than the task itself, not because it is cruel, but because it is visible. There are few places to hide errors within the castle's constant movement. Too many people share the same spaces, too many eyes notice when something does not flow as expected. An older servant may step beside you quietly and show you how to redo a task properly. Their tone is rarely harsh, often it is patient, not because they are forgiving by nature alone, but because they once stood exactly where you stand now. In more serious situations, responsibility becomes shared. If a mistake affects a larger task, others step in to correct it without hesitation. A missed cleaning leads to extra sweeping. A late preparation means faster coordination in the kitchen. Work is redistributed so the household continues without interruption, but the person who caused the delay feels it, not through punishment alone, but through awareness, the knowledge that others are now compensating for what was missed. And yet, the castle does not allow mistakes to define a person permanently. There is little space here for long memory when work is constant. What matters more than failure is response. How quickly you adapt, how willingly you correct yourself, how steadily you return to the rhythm. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. Mistakes become less frightening, not because they disappear, but because they become familiar. You learn which errors are small and easily corrected. You learn which ones require attention. And you learn, most importantly, how to recover without breaking the flow of the day. In this way, discipline is not built only through instruction, it is built through repetition, through experience, through quiet correction that slowly shapes behavior over time. Still, there are moments when embarrassment lingers longer than expected. A spilled bucket in a hallway, a misplaced item discovered just as it is urgently needed, a forgotten instruction that requires someone else to repeat extra work. In those moments, silence feels heavier than any spoken criticism. But even then, life moves forward quickly. There is no time for the castle to remain focused on a single error. The next task is always waiting, and so attention shifts, work continues, and the moment passes into memory rather than consequence. With time, you begin to notice something unexpected. The most experienced servants are not those who never make mistakes, they are those who recover from them most smoothly. They adjust, they adapt, they continue, without drawing attention to the disruption for longer than necessary. This becomes its own form of skill, a kind of quiet resilience. Learned only through repetition, and slowly, you begin to develop it too. One day, you spill a small amount of water near a corridor. You pause, you correct it, you continue walking, and no one needs to intervene. No one needs to remind you, the flow remains intact. That, more than perfection, is what the castle values most, not the absence of error, but the ability to restore order after it. As evening approaches and the light softens again across the stone walls, you realize something quietly settling within you. Mistakes still happen, but they no longer feel like endings, only interruptions. Temporary shifts in a much larger rhythm that never stops moving, and tomorrow, when the castle wakes again, you will be ready to continue within it. There are days in the castle when everything feels different. The usual rhythm of work does not disappear, but it changes its shape. The air itself seems lighter, as though even the stone walls are aware that something special is happening. Banners are hung across courtyards, their colors catching the wind in slow, graceful movement. Fresh rushes are laid across the floors. Torches are lit earlier than usual, even though the sun is still high. It is a festival day, a day of celebration for the Lord's household. From a distance, it appears almost effortless. Musicians are tuning their instruments in the great hall. Guests are beginning to arrive, their voices mixing with the sound of hooves and carriage wheels outside the gate. Laughter rises briefly, then fades into conversation. To those who enter as visitors, it feels like the castle has transformed itself into something alive with joy. But for you, the day begins much earlier, before the first guest arrives, before the first note of music is played, before the first cup is raised in celebration. The castle is already in motion, because festivals do not create less work, they create more. Every surface must be cleaner than usual, every room must look untouched by effort, every corner must appear as though it has always been ready for celebration. In the kitchens, the heat is constant, not the slow, steady warmth of ordinary days, but an intense, focused energy. Roasts are prepared in larger quantities, bread is baked in continuous cycles, sauces are stirred, tasted, adjusted, and stirred again. Nothing can be late, nothing can be missing. Every dish has its exact moment to appear in the hall above, and that timing must be perfect. In the courtyard, servants move more quickly than usual, though never in chaos. Water is carried. Tables are arranged, benches are checked and adjusted, decorations are placed carefully, always with attention to symmetry and presentation. It is not only work, it is preparation for a performance, because festivals are not simply celebrations inside the castle, they are displays, a demonstration of order, wealth, and stability, and every servant plays a role in maintaining that appearance. When the guests begin to arrive, the castle changes its tone, voices become louder, footsteps more frequent, color and movement fill spaces that were quiet only hours before. Yet even in the middle of this energy, servants remain almost invisible. They move along the edges of the celebration, refilling cups before they are empty, replacing dishes before they are noticed as missing, clearing spaces quietly so conversation can continue uninterrupted. There is a strange contrast here. Joy exists in the center of the room, but labor exists around its edges. Music plays in the hall, but behind the doors, there is constant preparation. A servant carries trays that will never be seen by guests until they are already complete. Another adjusts a candle that has begun to lean too far. Someone else wipes a spilled drop of wine from a table before it can draw attention. Everything is maintained so smoothly that the celebration appears effortless. Even laughter depends on invisible coordination. Yet, within all of this, there are moments when you can see the festival from the other side. Standing in a doorway for just a breath too long, you catch fragments of what the guests experience: the glow of candlelight reflecting off polished metal goblets, the sound of music echoing across vaulted ceilings, the warmth of shared conversation among people who rarely gather in one place. For a brief moment, it feels distant, almost like another world layered on top of your own. But you cannot remain there, not for long. A voice calls your name, a task continues, a tray must be delivered, and you step back into movement. As the evening deepens, the castle grows brighter rather than darker, more candles are lit, more food is brought out, more wine is poured. The celebration continues long after ordinary work hours would have ended, and still, the rhythm beneath it all remains unchanged: work, service, attention, care. Only the surface has shifted into celebration. For servants, festival days are not breaks from labor, they are expansions of it: longer hours, faster movement, greater precision. And yet, there is something quietly different about these days. Even while working harder, there is a sense of participation in something larger than routine, not as guests, not as observers, but as the unseen structure that makes the celebration possible. Without you, there would be no order, no flow, no continuity between one moment of joy and the next. As the final hours of the festival slowly begin to settle, and guests begin to leave or rest, the castle gradually returns to its quieter form. Candles burn lower, voices fade, tables grow empty once again, and only then does the weight of the day fully reveal itself, not as exhaustion alone, but as the quiet realization that celebration itself required an entire hidden world of effort to exist. And tomorrow, that world will continue as before. The castle is rarely a place where emotions are spoken openly. Everything here moves too quickly, too closely, too constantly for feelings to be displayed like stories in a song, and yet, they still exist. They simply live in quieter forms, in glances that last a little too long, in moments when two people happen to cross paths more often than coincidence should allow. In the soft understanding that grows between individuals who share the same exhausting rhythm of life. By now, you know many faces, not in a formal way, but in the way repetition etches familiarity into memory. The servant who always arrives early to the kitchen fire, the one who hums softly while carrying water buckets, the one who never speaks much, but always notices when someone is struggling. Inside the castle, where privacy is rare, emotional distance also becomes difficult to maintain. People see each other too often, work beside each other too closely, share spaces too constantly, and slowly, something subtle begins to form, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. Affection in a world like this does not begin with grand declarations. It begins with awareness, a shared pause during a difficult task, a moment of help offered without being asked, a warm piece of bread quietly left for someone who missed a meal. These small actions carry more meaning than words ever could, because words are often limited here. Time is limited, space is limited, even silence is shared, and so feelings grow in fragments, in glances exchanged across crowded kitchens, in brief smiles that appear and disappear before they are noticed by others, in the quiet relief of seeing someone return safely from a long errand outside the castle walls. Romance, in this environment, is never simple. It cannot unfold freely. There are rules, there are expectations, there are responsibilities that do not pause for personal emotion. Two servants might work side by side for months before ever speaking beyond necessity. Even then, conversation is often shaped by duty. Pass me that bucket, check the fire, close that door. But over time, something changes beneath those words. The rhythm between them becomes familiar, predictable in a comforting way. And in that predictability, trust begins to form, not the kind spoken about in grand stories, but the kind built from shared exhaustion and repeated presence. There are moments when someone adjusts your work without needing to be asked, or quietly takes on an extra task so you can rest for a few minutes, or simply stands nearby during a difficult day. offering silent support without explanation. These are the moments where connection deepens. Still, there is always distance, not emotional distance, but practical distance, because the castle does not pause for personal bonds. If one person is reassigned, they may move to another part of the household. If duties change, they may no longer cross paths as often. If work increases, even brief conversations become rare, and so, relationships remain fragile in their timing. Existing only as long as circumstances allow, this gives them a certain quiet intensity, a sense that every shared moment matters more because it may not be repeated in the same way again. Sometimes, at the end of the day, two servants might find themselves in the same corridor without immediate task or instruction. Just for a brief moment, no urgency, no orders, only the quiet presence of another person who understands the same life, and in that pause, even silence feels meaningful. A nod, a small smile, then the return to work, nothing dramatic, nothing spoken aloud. But something remembered, of course. Not every connection grows into something deeper. Many remain simple friendships, many remain professional familiarity, and that is enough, because survival inside the castle does not depend on romance, it depends on cooperation. Still, the human heart does not always follow structure. It notices kindness, it remembers comfort. It responds to familiarity in ways that are difficult to control, and so, within the hidden layers of daily labor, quiet forms of affection continue to exist, not as stories told openly, but as moments lived privately within a shared, crowded world. As night begins to settle again over the castle, those small connections fade back into routine. Servants return to their quarters, corridors grow quieter, fires dim, and everything returns to its steady rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, something unspoken remains, carried quietly from one day to the next. Inside the castle, most things feel fixed. The walls do not move, the routines rarely change. Even the days, in their quiet repetition, begin to feel like they are shaped by something older than memory itself. And yet, there is one question that lingers in the background of many servant lives. Could things ever change? Could someone who begins here ever become something more? The answer is not simple, because medieval life does not offer equality in the way modern minds might expect. Birth often defines the first shape of a person's future. The village you come from, the family you are born into, the skills you inherit. All of these quietly influence where you begin, and most servants begin at the same place. At the bottom of a vast structure, but bottom does not always mean still. Within the castle, movement upward is rare, but not impossible. It does not happen quickly, it does not happen dramatically, it happens through time, observation, and trust. A servant who proves reliable in small tasks may slowly be given larger responsibilities. Someone who learns quickly in the kitchen might be moved closer to food preparation rather than simple cleaning. A stable worker who understands animals deeply may eventually assist the stable master. Progress is not announced. It is assigned quietly, one step at a time. Often, the person experiencing it does not even realize they are moving upward until they look back and notice how different their duties have become. But even this movement has limits. The castle is structured like layers. At the base are the laborious, above them, skilled servants, above them, household supervisors, and above all, the noble family whose position is inherited rather than earned through service. For most servants, rising means moving within the system, not beyond it. Yet even within those boundaries, change matters. A cleaner may become a trusted chamber assistant. A kitchen worker may become responsible for entire meals. A stable boy may grow into someone who manages valuable horses used for travel or military purposes. These roles carry more responsibility, but also more recognition, and recognition, in a world where most labor is invisible, holds its own kind of weight. There are also rare cases where a servant gains favor from someone of higher rank, not through sudden fortune, but through consistent reliability, a noble who trusts a particular servant to handle private matters, a steward who relies on one person more than others due to proven loyalty. In such cases, a servant's position may improve, not by title alone, but by access. Access to better living conditions, better tools, slightly more comfortable responsibilities. Even small improvements can feel significant when compared to the strict simplicity of ordinary service. Still, the idea of leaving service entirely is far less common. For many, the castle becomes a long-term place of work, a stable structure within an unstable world outside its walls. Villages change, farms struggle. Seasons bring uncertainty, but within the castle, food is regular. Shelter is steady, and routine, though demanding, is dependable. So for many, staying is not only necessity, but security. Yet even within this stability, ambition does exist, quietly, carefully. A young servant might learn to read and write from a literate clerk during spare moments. Another might observe the steward's methods, hoping to understand how decisions are made. Someone else might save small amounts of coin over years, dreaming of a different future beyond the castle walls. These ambitions are rarely spoken aloud, because speaking them too openly can feel unrealistic or even dangerous, but they remain present, like hidden embers beneath steady ash. Of course, there are also stories of servants who eventually became trusted administrators, or those who left service to take skilled positions in towns or monasteries, or individuals who married into slightly better circumstances after years of stability and reputation. These stories travel quietly through servant quarters, often repeated during evening rest, not as promises, but as reminders. That change, however rare, is not impossible. Still, for most, the path remains steady rather than transformative. Work, learn, endure, adapt, and continue, because even without dramatic change in status, there is growth of another kind, a deeper understanding of the castle, a mastery of tasks once unfamiliar, a quiet confidence in movement and responsibility. As you walk through the familiar corridors now, you notice how different you feel compared to your first days, not because your position has changed dramatically, but because you have changed within it, and perhaps that is the most common form of rising in the castle, not upward into a new life, but deeper into the one you already inhabit. As evening returns and the castle settles once more into its familiar quiet, the question still lingers softly in the background. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, where might this life eventually lead? And the answer, as always inside these walls, is not revealed all at once, only slowly, through time. By the time you've lived long enough inside the castle's rhythm, you begin to notice something interesting. The world outside does not always understand what life here is actually like. Stories are told about medieval servants, passed down through generations, shaped more by imagination than lived experience. Some are dramatic. Some are simplified. Some are so distant from reality that they feel like they belong to another world entirely, and yet, those stories often sound convincing to people who have never stood within these stone corridors. One of the most common ideas is that servants lived in constant misery, without any structure or comfort at all, but the truth is more layered. Life here is not comfortable in the modern sense, but it is structured, it has order, it has routine, it has moments of stability that come from repetition and shared responsibility. The castle is not chaos, it is a system. Another myth is that servants were always alone, isolated, and disconnected from one another, but as you have learned by now, the opposite is closer to reality. Privacy is rare, yes. But isolation is even rarer. People work together constantly, they share spaces, tasks, and timing. They learn each other's habits simply by existing in proximity every day. A third myth suggests that servants had no skills beyond basic labor, but inside the castle, survival depends on learning quickly and adapting constantly. Cooking is not simple, it requires knowledge of timing, fire, ingredients, and large-scale coordination. Cleaning is not just sweeping floors, but maintaining entire systems of space that must remain functional at all times. Even carrying messages or managing supplies requires memory, awareness, and responsibility. These are not mindless tasks, they are specialized roles, even if they are not always recognized as such. Another misunderstanding is that servants had no emotional life beyond duty, but emotions exist everywhere humans exist. Even in places defined by structure and hierarchy, friendships form, frustrations appear. Moments of humor arise unexpectedly in the middle of exhaustion, and, as you've seen before, quiet forms of affection and trust develop over time. The castle does not remove emotion, it simply shapes when and how it can be expressed. There is also the idea that medieval life was static, that nothing changed from one generation to the next. But within the castle, small changes happen constantly. New servants arrive, others leave, roles shift slightly as trust is built or broken. Techniques improve over time as experience accumulates. Even architecture evolves slowly, repaired and adjusted across years. Change exists, just not in dramatic bursts. Another myth often imagined is that servants were invisible in every sense, but while they may be overlooked by the noble household, they are deeply present to each other. They notice everything: who is tired, who is absent, who is learning quickly, who is struggling quietly. Within their own world, they are not invisible at all. They are constantly seen. One of the most romanticized ideas from outside is that life inside a castle was either endlessly brutal or strangely glamorous, with little in between. But the reality, as you now understand, is something quieter: work that repeats, days that flow into each other, responsibilities that rarely end but also rarely explode into chaos. It is not a life of extremes, it is a life of continuity. Even the relationship between servants and the noble household is often misunderstood. It is not always defined by cruelty or distance, it is defined by structure, expectation, dependence, and routine interaction that rarely crosses into personal familiarity. There is respect, but also separation, proximity, but also division. The truth about medieval servants does not fit neatly into simple categories. It is not purely harsh, it is not purely stable. It is a balance shaped by necessity rather than design, and perhaps that is what makes it difficult to imagine from the outside, because real life inside the castle is not dramatic enough to be myth, but not simple enough to be easily explained. As another quiet evening settles over the stone walls, you begin to realize something subtle: the myths that exist outside these walls are shaped by distance, but the reality inside them is shaped by repetition, and between those two worlds, there is a gap that only lived experience can truly fill. Long after the castle has fallen silent, long after the banners have faded and the torches have gone cold, the ground itself still remembers, not in words, not in stories, but in fragments, in broken objects buried beneath centuries of dust and soil, in walls that still stand, even when everything else has disappeared. This is where archaeologists begin their work, not with imagination, but with evidence. When they carefully examine medieval sites, they do not find a single story, They find layers, each layer holding a different moment of life, stacked quietly on top of the last, and among those layers, traces of servants often appear in the most unexpected places, not in grand halls, not in royal chambers, but in kitchens, courtyards, storage rooms, and narrow passageways where daily life once moved with constant repetition. They find pottery that was used and repaired many times, simple bowls, worn wooden utensils, knives that were sharpened repeatedly until their original shape slowly changed. These objects do not speak of luxury, they speak of use, of routine, of lives built around constant activity. In some excavations, archaeologists discover hearths that were used continuously, with layers of ash showing just how often food was prepared. Not once a day in isolation, but again and again, across long periods of time, feeding many people who never paused for long. They also find sleeping areas that reveal something subtle about privacy. Multiple bedding spaces close together, shared rooms with limited separation, signs that rest was not solitary, but communal. Even the arrangement of space tells a story. Narrow corridors designed for movement rather than comfort, staircases worn down more on the edges than the center, showing constant foot traffic from people who carried water, food, and supplies up and down throughout the day. Archaeologists also find evidence of repair rather than replacement, tools mended multiple times, structures patched instead of rebuilt, objects adapted to continue serving their purpose for as long as possible. This reflects something important about medieval service life: nothing was wasted easily. Everything was maintained, not because of sentiment, but because of necessity. Sometimes, written records are found alongside physical remains, household accounts, inventories of supplies, lists of provisions ordered for large estates. These documents often mention servants indirectly, through the tasks they performed rather than their names: cleaning of chambers, preparation of meals, delivery of supplies. The people themselves are rarely centered in these records, but their work is everywhere within them. Even absence becomes meaningful. In many places, archaeologists notice how little personal space is dedicated to servants compared to the vast areas reserved for noble life. This imbalance in physical space reflects the social structure of the time, but it also reveals something more subtle: how deeply the functioning of the castle depended on unseen labor. Without constant movement in kitchens, storage rooms, and corridors, the entire structure would have been impossible to maintain. In some sites, small personal items are discovered that hint at individuality within this structured world. A carved piece of wood, a simple brooch, a worn token carried for years. These objects suggest that even within strict routines, people held onto fragments of personal meaning, something private in a world where privacy was rare. Archaeology does not romanticize this life, it does not simplify it either. Instead, it reveals complexity, a world that was neither entirely harsh nor entirely stable, but deeply functional, built on systems of labor that supported everything else above it. And as each artifact is uncovered, a quiet truth becomes clearer. The castle was not only a place of nobility and power, it was also a place of constant human effort that rarely appears in grand stories, but remains preserved in stone, soil, and forgotten objects. And when you look at these discoveries together, they begin to form something larger than individual pieces, a silent portrait of lives that once moved through these spaces, not as background characters, but as the force that made the castle itself possible. By the time you reach the final hours of the castle's long rhythm, something subtle has changed in the way you see it. What once felt unfamiliar now feels predictable. What once felt overwhelming now feels structured, and what once felt like a distant world has become something you can almost walk through in your mind without hesitation. The stone corridors, the kitchens filled with steady heat, the courtyards where water is carried again and again, the endless cycle of movement that defines every corner of this place, it all begins to feel less like a setting and more like a living system you have come to understand from the inside. And now, standing at the edge of this journey, a final question remains, not about history alone, but about endurance. If you were placed here, without comfort, without privacy, without pause, could you survive it? At first, the answer feels obvious. Modern life has shaped expectations differently. Quiet rooms, personal space, rest that belongs only to you, choices that are not constantly shaped by necessity. But inside the castle, those things do not exist in the same way. Life is defined by repetition, by shared responsibility, by constant awareness of others moving around you, depending on you, and being depended on in return. Survival here is not about strength alone, it is about adaptation, learning quickly, observing carefully, moving without disrupting the flow that surrounds you at every moment. And yet, as you've seen throughout this journey, there is more to it than endurance. There is rhythm, there is familiarity, there is even, in its own quiet way, a form of belonging, not the kind built on freedom of choice, but the kind built on necessity shared by many people at once. The castle does not allow isolation, but it also does not allow complete invisibility. Everyone is part of something larger, every task connects to another, every person contributes to a system that continues whether they are noticed or not. So the question of survival becomes less about physical ability and more about emotional adjustment. Could you accept a life where privacy is rare, where rest is brief, where your time is rarely entirely your own, and perhaps more importantly, could you find meaning within it? As the final moments of this story settle, imagine the castle not as a distant historical structure, but as a place still echoing faintly with movement, footsteps in corridors that are no longer filled, fireplaces that no longer burn, rooms that no longer hold voices, but still remember them in silence. The servants who once lived here are gone, but their patterns remain in the imagination of history, in the way we understand labor, in the way we think about unseen effort, in the way we recognize that even the quietest lives can hold entire worlds within them. And so, as this journey comes to a close, the castle does not truly end, it simply fades, layer by layer, sound by sound, until only the idea of it remains, and perhaps that is the final thought it leaves behind. Not whether you would survive it, but what kind of person you would become if your entire life had to move at its pace, because in the end, the castle was never only made of stone, it was made of people, and their work still lingers in every imagined corridor, somewhere between history and memory.